A very large crisis may be looming, and it's not just important to any single country. This one is of international scope. The head of United Nations Food Agency is warning that the world is closer to another food crisis. He also calls for rules over speculative moves in commodity futures markets. Econ Report brings you more, and this is part one of our special report on the global food market.
The Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, released a report in January saying its global price index hit a record high last December. It raises concerns about the food crisis as seen in 2008, when soaring prices sparked riots in several countries, high inflation, and in some cases, deep trade deficits. Jackie Diouf, Director General of FAO, says, quote, higher prices and volatility will continue in the next year if we fail to tackle the structural causes of imbalances in the international agricultural system. Abdulrazak Abbasian, Secretary of the Intergovernmental Group on Grains, Trade and Markets Division, also has comments on it.
Prices are at the levels we had on the peak of 2007 and 2008, where, if you remember, was quite a bad season with many riots in many countries, and a season that was then associated with a food crisis here. So in that sense, it is quite alarming that we are heading, at least in terms of prices, into a situation where we see that it's getting ever closer to what we had witnessed just 2 years ago. Many factors were at play for this development to unfold. Grain prices were important, not as important as in the last episode in 2007 and 2008, which may be one reason why, in fact, the situation has been a bit calmer this time around, even though prices are as high.
The surge in agricultural markets such as wheat and sugar has fueled protests in parts of North Africa and the Middle East. Diouf also said that $44 billion in official development aid in agriculture is necessary, and that private investment should increase by $60 billion to $200 billion a year to feed the world's growing population. The FAO report shows the sugar and meat were at record highs, and its cereals index, which includes staples such as wheat, rice, and corn, rose to its highest level since August 2008.
Of course, the prices of maize and prices of wheat, prices of barley were the ones that actually rising quite sharply very early in the season, starting with the droughts in Russia, and then the ban on the exports, and then the floods in Pakistan, and then more bad weather almost everywhere, from Northern Europe to North America, and eventually the rains, the delayed harvests in Australia, and today we have floods in Australia and dry conditions in some parts of Latin America. So basically all these factors, the weather factors, have been quite determinant in pushing up some of the grain prices. For as far as the unfavorable weather conditions were concerned, the impacts are already clear, and they affected the 2010 crops.
Last year, severe weather and natural disasters have hit key grain-producing countries, including Russia and Australia, stoking supply shortage fears as demand from emerging nations such as China and India grows. Let's see more details about these countries' severe situation.
Abnormal heat triggered drought and fire in Russia last summer. The forest fires swept through more than 20 regions in the country. The damage to its agriculture sector is estimated at more than $1 billion so far. The heat and drought engulfed central Russia in mid-June with temperatures as high as 40 degrees Celsius. The abnormal hot temperatures killed more than 11 million hectares of crops, which was 26% of the total planted area. According to the Russian emergency minister, wildfires raging in the whole country last summer caused about $400 million in damage. The costs includes expenses for putting out fire, funding for house construction, and expenses for fuel. Rescuers and firefighters managed to save 4,000 residential areas from fire. Analysts believe that the event has added to the risk of food shortages in the world and increased global inflationary pressures. Serious drought is sending the nation's food prices sky high. Local grocery shoppers are worried about the double prices they see for bread, milk, and other staples. Suppliers forecast even higher prices of grits, flour, sunflower oil, bread, rice, dried fruits, and dairy products. The price hike varied from 3 to 100% for different food categories. The severe drought last summer affected 25,000 farmers and households in 43 regions of Russia. It is the most severe drought in 130 years. To tackle the consequences, the government began to embargo grain exports on August 15, 2010. The ban has immediate repercussions both in the world, demonstrating its dependence on one of the largest world grain exporters, and inside the country. It pushed global grain prices to reach the highest in 2 years. On December 29th, First Deputy Prime Minister Viktor Zhukov announced that the country will keep embargo on grain exports in place until July 1st, 2011. The export ban will be in force despite the domestic food market situation remaining stable. He said that if the grain export embargo had not been imposed, 12 million tons of grain would have been exported last year, resulting in domestic shortage. The government decided to start selling grain from its intervention stock, which will reach consumers right after New Year. He says 1,131 million tons of grain from the intervention stock should be shipped to 19 regions of Russia. According to the Russian RBC news agency, the country will also extend its export embargo on wheat flour until June 30th this year. The embargo was originally set to expire January 1st. However, wheat and rye flour have been excluded from the government list of grain products banned for export.
Also affected by abnormal weather, Australia is suffering a food crisis of its own. Flood-stricken Queensland areas have lost considerable amounts of output.
Devastating floods in Australia have raised questions about how much damage occurred to the wheat crop, which was being harvested when the waters hit. The executive director of Sayura Partners Strategic Investment and Cooperative Advisory has his view on the impact of the flood.
Absolutely. Agriculture has been significantly impacted by the floods, and with Australia being a net exporter of food, it's going to impact both domestically and internationally.
In Australia, one of the world's top 4 wheat exporters, the biggest flood in the country's history forced Queensland's major grain terminal of Fisherman Island to shut down. Although Queensland is a small wheat exporter compared with other states, the shutdown is a setback to the national crop. Heavy rains have already reduced the amount of high-protein grain preferred by major markets. The Australian Farm Institute Executive Director Mick Keogh says up to a third of 2010's grain harvest would be lost. The total value would come in at about $2 billion. The government had to shut down a key grain port, adding further restrictions to the country's exports and underlying concern about tight global grain supplies and rising food inflation.
Besides Russia and Australia, other countries in the world were also facing high food prices. But since some of these countries' citizens spend a high proportion of their income on food, higher prices for it represent a much more pressing issue.
In India, onion prices are skyrocketing. It's a big deal considering onions are a staple in almost every local dish.
So tell us about the effect which has happened in the people due to the rise of the onions.
People feel as if they are harassing, these governments are harassing them, and today each and every commodity is very costly, and this as far as onion is very costly, and people are feeling burdened from the government.
Because onions are used almost in all the main course. All the main course.
House in the India, people every dish, whether it's any type of Indian people, they use onion only.
The IANS news agency says India is also importing onions from Pakistan to tackle the shortage. The government has asked state-run cooperative stores to sell onions cheaper to cool prices. The spike in onion prices comes as overall food inflation runs at nearly 10%, causing huge hardship for India's impoverished millions.
2010 is a hard year for those countries suffering from high food prices. But 2011 has a new and good start. Tomorrow's Economy Report tells you more.